you for joining our sixth and the final on this first series of presentations for hemp growers. I am Suresh Kimire, Assistant Extension Educator at UConn. Today we are going to cover hemp IPM, focusing on insect, pests, and weeds. In our previous webinars, we talked about Connecticut regulations, seed selection, propagation, soil health, and hemp diseases. Those presentations are recorded and are available for use for you to watch, and they are available on Connecticut RC&D website. We'll post that link. Looks like somebody is not hearing. Okay. Jeff, is everybody else hearing?
I'm hearing. Can all attendees hear Suresh?
Okay, probably there is some issue with your speakers.
I've noticed if sometimes the audio settings get screwy, and so if you click on the little arrow next to the mic on the bottom left, you can choose what speaker and what microphone, and so I'm wondering if that might help.
Yeah. Right next to mute, there is up arrow and audio setting. And if you click on the audio setting and choose the speakers, that might help. Okay. And those the series of presentations are available for you to watch at Connecticut Department of RC&D website. Some notes for today's webinar. This meeting has been approved for 1.5 Connecticut Deep pesticide recertification credits for 1A category. That's for plant. For those of who you are seeking credits, you probably already provided your pesticide applicator license information when you registered for this webinar. In case you didn't, you can email that information to me. All I need is your pesticide application license number and your name and address. I'll put my email address in the chat box after a while. And this webinar is being recorded. I see the sign recording. And while you are muted, the participants, the chat box and Q&A box is open the entire time, and you can pose your questions and use the chat box to network among the attendees. We encourage that you do networking and share your information. And if you have comments and questions regarding this talk today, please feel free to share using the chat box. This webinar series was made possible by the planning partners, which include Connecticut Department of Agriculture, Connecticut Hemp Industry Association, UConn Extension, USDA NRCS, and Connecticut RC&D. With that,
can you see?
I will hand it over to Scott, and thank you so much, Scott, for joining us and sharing what have you been working on and finding, especially regarding hemp insects and weeds.
And something I did, Suresh, you can hear me, right?
Yes, I can hear you.
And can you see my screen?
First slide, yep.
Perfect. So something I did, I lost the chat box and Q&A, but I can still see you. So we don't need to mess with Zoom anymore, but if you do see questions or chat pop up for some reason, I can no longer see them. I think when I changed my screen sharing, so I apologize for that. Well, thank you very much for inviting me down. So as Suresh mentioned, I'm from UVM Extension. I work with the Northwest Crops and Soils program. Heather Darby, who presented as part of this series, leads that program, and we've been doing hemp research in Vermont for about 5 years now. We've worked in and continue to do work in grain as well as hemp for fiber. And now increasingly, we're doing work with flower production for essential oils, predominantly CBD, but that's changing as the market has shifted. And actually now in Vermont, cannabis, high THC cannabis, is now legal, and so it'll be flower production for THC as well as CBD and the various derivatives. So I am going to talk a bunch about insect pests in New England, as well as some general weed management, and then I'll end with some discussion around hemp IPM in general. I won't spend too much time talking about diseases because my understanding is that you've already had a top-notch pathologist talking about hemp diseases, but a lot of the management for pests sort of straddles weeds, diseases, and insects. And so I'll touch a little bit on all of those. Please, if you have questions, feel free to interrupt. I'm happy to have this be more of a dialogue than a monologue. So as I mentioned, I'll start out talking about identifying those insects and other arthropods in your hemp. I want to, I'll talk predominantly about those bad guys, but also my background is actually in biological control. And so you can't talk about the bad guys without also talking about all the good things out there. And I'm not going to be talking as much about diseases, because I'm not a pathologist, but I'm happy to share with you what I know. Share some results from some research we did last year throughout New England. Actually, Suresh was involved in that work, and then I'll focus on, again, some of the IPM strategies and tactics for controlling pests in hemp, at least in New England. Yeah, so like I said, let's start out with the bad guys. And at least in Vermont and also in other parts of the Northeast, cannabis aphid is one of the most common pests on hemp. You do find other aphids. I'm wondering, Suresh, I don't know if can you see my little arrow when I do this?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay,
yeah.
Beautiful. So I've got my screen sharing set up, so at least you can see my arrow, even though I can't see you guys. So the way that you can tell cannabis aphids from other aphids is cannabis aphids have these little horns, and you might not be able to see them in this picture, and it's really not that important because the management is pretty much the same. But the aphids are found on leaves and stems. Mostly you'll find them on the underside, although you can find them all over, especially when the population numbers grow. Early in the season, you can sometimes find some winged versions. Those are the reproductives that land on your plants, and then they start popping out babies. The interesting thing about aphids, if you didn't know this, they're actually born pregnant. So you've got grandma giving birth to her daughter with her granddaughters inside her daughter. So kind of crazy. And that's how they have the ability to really explode in populations size in a relatively short period of time. So they will feed on the phloem. And you often don't really see a lot of result of their feeding. And really what they're doing is sucking the life out of your plants. As the populations grow over the season, you can actually see a slight color change from sort of a cream, light green to a pale, sometimes pink or light brown. Those are the wingless versions. The winged ones are a sort of darker color. You can kind of see in this picture right here, mix of winged and wingless. And then you've got wingless reproductives that are popping out babies. And so those little cream colored are the granddaughters. And when you get really, really high population levels of aphids, the vigor of your plants is greatly reduced. And you can actually get also formation of mold because aphids secrete a sugary substance called honeydew. And then that honeydew on the leaf surface can promote sooty mold. Another really important pest in cannabis is two-spotted spider mites. Not as big of a deal generally outdoors. It's much more widely known as a problem for indoor grow operations. Most of my work is focused in the field, but it is worth mentioning two-spotted spider mites because again, they can become really problematic. So again, like aphids, often on the underside of the leaf, they're a little bit smaller than aphids. They get their name from the fact that the adults at least have two black spots on them. The nymphs and larvae, the immatures, don't have those spots. Other than those spots, they're sort of just a straw color, fairly kind of pale. You'll often notice the sort of cast skins, just like with aphids and other small soft-bodied insects, that it sometimes are confused with living versions, and so you will also see eggs alongside the cast skins. These what you will see, especially when populations get high enough, you start to see what's called stippling or leaf flecking. So this sort of rust-colored leaf is just a really heavy infestation on the underside, and then you'll start to see webbing, and that's why they're called spider mites. They are related to spiders, but they're not spiders themselves, but they do spin as webs, these webs. The populations of spider mites, especially out in the field, really start to increase late summer when you've got hot, dry conditions, sort of the different set of conditions for aphids. Aphids tend to do a little better when it's cooler because they can dry out pretty quickly. All right. To our knowledge, hemp russet mite is not endemic in this region. So in Vermont, we've not found it at all. I have heard reports in other parts of the Northeast, not reports of hemp russet mite persisting, but coming in on plant material shipped up from other parts of the country. So it's good that we don't know that we don't know of any endemic populations, but it's bad that it can come in on plant material. So you should at least know about it, even if we don't have them here. So these you don't see with your naked eye, unlike the two-spotted spider mites that you can see. So these are really, really, really small. Again, mostly on the underside. They can develop on the stems. The stems can come really sort of, the leaves, excuse me, can become really sort of brittle and start to break. And then you'll also sometimes see the uprolling. But a lot of things can cause that uprolling that I've seen just sort of just plant genetics sometimes lead to phenotypes that are curling that have nothing to do with hemp russet mite. And you can also get hemp russet mite that doesn't lead to that curling. So even though that curling is most commonly associated with russet mite, it really isn't helpful for diagnosing. In really, really severe infestations, you get sort of a gray or bronze in color. And that's when you get really serious suppressed growth. The russet mites can also get into the developing buds and do some serious damage there as well. Another really important pest, depending upon the year and the conditions, can be European corn borer. So European corn borer, as the name suggests, the hemp is not the preferred host. Corn is definitely preferred, but just like in corn, these guys can get into the stalks and cause lodging. And if it's early in the season, so I should have backed up here really quickly. There are two flights, particularly in your area in Connecticut. There's definitely two flights. Here in Vermont, we mostly get two flights. Although when we have really cool years and there's not enough degree day accumulation. In some areas, there might only be a single flight. But for Connecticut, certainly 2 flights. The first flight, when those eggs are being laid, if there's no corn in the fields, that can be a problem. So 2019 here in Vermont, we had a really cool wet spring. It's kind of like I'm looking out the window right now. I'm seeing just gray and haze. And so if we continue to have really cold, wet conditions and corn can't get planted, the moths are going to look for something else to lay their eggs on. And so in 2019, we had a huge year for hemp because it was right after the Farm Bill was passed and legalized industrial hemp. And so there was a ton of hemp being grown and the corn wasn't planted. And those were like a collision course for really bad conditions for European corn borer. Last year, it was a nice, warm, dry spring. Corn got planted. There was less hemp. We saw very little European corn borer in hemp last year. So it very much has to do with what else is going on out in the field. The second flight, those moths that lay eggs, they're laying on more mature plants that have flowers that are starting to be developed. And so there's an image here of a European corn borer in a hemp flower, and you can see they just make a complete mess of the flower. There's all sorts of webbing and frass, insect poop, and so makes that bud completely unmarketable. Another one that I like to mention are Japanese beetles. Just like European corn borer, hemp is not preferred. There are 2 phases of the life cycle of Japanese beetles that can do damage. The grubs, these little C-shaped grubs that live underground feeding on roots, are not a problem for hemp. Most hemp is really just not even in the field at the time that those grubs are feeding on roots. And so if you were growing turf, on the other hand, it would be a different story, right? So it's the adults that are also doing damage that can do quite a bit of chewing damage on leaves. And so this picture here, you see what's called a skeletonized leaves. They chew away most of the leaf, leaving just the veins. And the adults, at least in Vermont, they emerge usually the beginning of July, end of June, and then they kind of taper off in August. And so unless your plants are really, really small, you've just planted them out, for hemp, Japanese beetles do a little bit of chewing damage, but really are not significant economic pests. How am I doing on time here? Perfect. Another problematic group of insects are flea beetles. There can be a couple different species depending upon where you are in the country, but we generally have 2 different species of flea beetles. There's another one that I haven't identified to species yet that is really doing a lot of damage early in the season, but it's mostly sort of very superficial damage on the leaves. So you see this leaf here, you got sort of these tiny little shot holes, and that's characteristic of flea beetles, right? Those really tiny shot holes in the leaves. Just like Japanese beetles, the larvae also feed on plant roots, but just like Japanese beetles, for hemp, that's not significant. So it's these little shot holes, and really when you've got a sort of really large populations early in the season and really young plants, that those 2 factors could lead to damage, but generally they don't do significant economic damage to hemp plants. There is a later generation, another generation of adults that overwinter late in the season. And at that point, the plants are so big that any of that feeding damage is really not significant. Cruising along, potato leafhoppers in general, specifically, but leafhoppers in general can do some damage to hemp. Potato leafhoppers, they're blown in on wind currents in this, usually end of May, beginning of June. And if you've got you got a leaf like here, and you see one of these sort of pale green guys, this is a nymph. This is the result of an adult. So the adult shows up first, excuse me as my voice cracks. The adult shows up first. the adults do less damage, but they can fly, right? So they land on your plant, they're going to do a little bit of feeding damage. It's the next generation and subsequent generations. These are less mobile, they don't fly, so they sort of scurry around on the underside of the leaves. And so as they're growing and they're sucking the life out of your plants, hemp being one of them, you can get first the sort of yellowing tips, and then ultimately this browning damage, which is called hopper burn. And if you're seeing that damage, if you're seeing the hopper burn, it's too late. Because what's happening is as they're sucking the life out of your plants, they're also injecting saliva, and that saliva has enzymes that lead to cell death. And so again, if you're seeing this, these curled, crunchy leaves, the saliva is already in there, your cells are already dying. It really, all it does, just like with aphids, really what you're doing is reducing plant vigor. It's not going to be impacting the flowers later in the season, but if you've got young plants that are out late in June and you've got a nice flush population of these leafhopper nymphs, that can be sort of a drain on plant growth. Another one I'll mention are thrips. Thrips are really small, even smaller than those potato leafhoppers. You can see them. So this is a picture here. This is not hemp, but you can see these little yellow things. Those are the thrips. And the streaking damage, you see yellow streaking and then also some black. The black is the insect feces, and the streaking, that's the damage done by their feeding. If you've got developing plants, those leaves can sort of be a little distorted as they grow after the damage, right? And so these guys aggregate in the youngest tissue. You see that stippling. It's a little bit different stippling. If I can get my pointer, it's a little bit different than the two-spotted spider mites. It's kind of a whitish color because they're actually feeding on the cells inside the leaf. You do get multiple generations of thrips, and if you do have a population and it grows over time, and you have a warm sort of dry summer, that's when you can have a problem later on in the season. But typically not really a big deal for hemp in New England. I like to talk about tarnished plant bugs, even though it sounds like for this crowd, there's not a lot of hemp for grain being grown in Connecticut, but in New York, there are some growers that are growing hemp for grain. We've done a bunch of trials, and tarnished plant bug can be problematic for those grain growers, because what these do is, well, they're actually omnivores, so they're feeding on some insects, but they also feed on some plants. And they can really, in their plant feeding, like you see this little bug right here on the developing flower, and the feeding on the developing flower ultimately can either lead to an abortion of the flower or a deformed flower that doesn't have a seed, in the case of a fertilized female flower. And so it's really a problem, mostly for, like I said, for grain, not really a problem for if you're growing for flower production, for essential oils, that sort of thing. So I put this together a couple of months ago just to kind of get an idea of like what the whole season looks like. And so I've just essentially the season for growing hemp. And this is for Vermont, so it's a little bit skewed later, but for Connecticut, you have essentially the same pattern, even if it's a little, if you have things showing up a little bit earlier. So again, aphids and spider mites, if they occur, they'll sort of build as the season goes on. Potato leafhoppers, depending upon when they fly in on wind currents, anywhere from the end of May to sort of mid-June. And again, there are multiple generations and they'll build over time. European corn borer, for you guys in Connecticut, certainly you're going to have 2 generations, and they're discrete and they do damage to different parts. So again, the early corn borer, these are going to hit your main stalks and cause lodging. Later later flight, those are going to lead to damage in the flowers. Japanese beetle really only around for about a month and a half or so, kind of before flower development, and so not really a problem. Flea beetles, 2 discrete generations. Again, if there's a problem, it's going to be in this early season when you have really small plants and a high population of overwintering adults. Thrips and LYGUS bugs, again, those will build over the season, but are not problematic. And then again, hemp russet might, if they show up, but they haven't yet in Vermont. One thing that you might notice is conspicuously absent is corn earworm. So we actually don't have any corn earworm issues in hemp in New York, excuse me, in Vermont for a variety of reasons. You'll see in a moment, we did some scouting throughout New England and in New York, and you do start to see a little bit of corn earworm show up. But if you head down south into Kentucky and North Carolina and Virginia, where they're starting to grow a lot more hemp, corn earworm is the #1 pest. And so I guess consider ourselves lucky that we don't have to deal with that. So that's why it's not here. All right. So again, I want to talk about those good guys because you do see a bunch of pests, but actually in Vermont, we see a lot more of the good guys than we see of pests. So lace wings, their adults have these beautiful wings, really sort of decorated, and that's where they get their name from. But the larvae are actually the ones that do all the damage. So these guys down here are lacewing larvae, and they've got these honking jaws that they suck the life out of. See, these are little aphids that it's just sucking the life out of. And you might actually see every now and again a stalked egg. So lacewing eggs are the only eggs that are on stalks. So if you see any of these, they're really doing serious damage to small soft-bodied insects like aphids. Another multi-generational beneficial, as I like to say, are ladybugs. So the larvae and the adults are doing really good job of cleaning your plants of small soft-bodied insects like aphids. Minute pirate bugs and parasitoid wasps, these are really, really small. The bugs are sucking the life out of your pests. The parasitoid wasps, they lay an egg in the pest, and then out comes a wasp instead of the pest. So we like them. Spider mite destroyers are really common anytime you have spider mites. These are actually a specialist type of ladybug that feed just on spider mites. So anytime you see spider mites, you're guaranteed to see spider mite destroyers shortly thereafter. Hoverflies, they have predaceous maggots that just go to town on aphids. So the adults look like bees, they're not, but they have these predaceous larvae that just are like aphid destroyers. And of course, spiders. All spiders are good, and so if you see spiders, they're in there taking care of potential pests for you. All right, what I'd like to do is shift gears and talk a little bit about some data that we collected last year throughout New England. And I'll talk about the methods here really quickly, but first we had to assemble a crack team of scouts. So Suresh, as well as Sarah Grumman in Massachusetts, a group of us in Vermont, and I dipped my toe in New York a little bit, and then John Jemison and a tech out in Maine. We went out during a couple of crucial periods on 18 farms throughout New England and New York. I guess we'll consider this an honorary member of New England, but we wanted to get an idea of what was really out there throughout the entire landscape in hemp fields. You will notice that there's a giant gaping hole, and that's New Hampshire. So at least as of last year, they didn't have a state plan, and so there weren't really any hemp growers in New Hampshire. So that's why there's this gap in our data, which might change because I think this year New Hampshire growers can get licensed under the USDA since there's no state plan. All right, so those are our scouting locations throughout New England. What did we do? Like I mentioned, we went out during 2 crucial periods. We decided, all right, if we're growers and we want to really think about when is the most important time to be making management decisions, we decided, well, certainly during flower development, right? All of the growers we worked with are growing for essential oils, and so having an idea of what's in the hemp during that period of flower development was important. So we went out roughly mid-August, depending upon where. And then also another crucial period is just before harvest, again, depending upon what variety and where they were located. We're talking mid-September to the beginning of October. Typical scouting, we went to 5 different locations in those fields, and we did that to, the sort of standard W-shaped pattern. At each of the spots, our scouts stopped and looked at 3 plants at each of those 5 locations. And when they were looking at those plants, we had them looking at the leaves, and we want to get a sort of representative scout. So we looked at the top, sort of mid and then low level on the plant. So that left us with 75 measurements per field. We also, in the latter period, also looked at the buds. So we looked at the terminal cola and then 4 of the side ones. And we were looking at incidence of insects, so the number of individuals per leaf, or cola bud in that case. We also looked at damage, although I'm not going to present any of the results from damage because it really wasn't informative. We also looked at disease incidence and severity, but I'm not going to share the disease data today. Right. We had a sort of standard scouting form. We had all of our scouts essentially go out there with the same instructions and do the same thing. We wanted to keep everything as uniform as possible. And so we have these sort of standard forms that we developed at UVM Extension, and then we share them with growers, and then we adapted that for this particular project. In the case of damage, we tried to the best of our ability have a damage scale. So we rated the percentage of the leaf that was damaged, like McPartland suggested. Although again, for insects, we didn't really see much in the terms of damage, and so I'm not presenting any of that. Just going to present like the presence or absence. And this is what we found in a nutshell, right? So you guys in Connecticut, you're lucky. You had everything that we were looking for, and then some. So we have here, I have the state and then the main pests. So aphids, European corn borer, flea beetles, potato leafhoppers, and then sort of an other category, which might include like corn earworm in the case of Connecticut, and some other really minor pests in the other states. So I'm going to drill down a little bit into the data, not go too far. And so for all of those 4 main insect pests, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the same type of figure. So all of these have a map, and this is called a heat map. So when you have a big red circle like this means that there were a lot of aphids, and that the percentage of all of the insects was predominantly aphids. Right, so big and red mean a lot of that particular target, right? Whereas small and yellow mean not a lot of anything. So this site here didn't have much of anything at all, particularly not very many aphids, right? So again, big and red is bad, small and yellow is good, right? And so again, what this is telling us is aphids were pretty much throughout all of the region, not as much in Maine, but the rest of the region, lots of aphids, and in some sites, quite a bit of aphids. Again, big circles mean a lot of aphid, and then red means a high total incidence of all insects. Okay. Flea beetles, again, same exact figure, right, with the heat map, right? So there were a relatively high number of flea beetles at this one site, but again, because it's because it's that sort of yellowish orange, that tells us there weren't a high total number of insects. So of those insects that were present, most of them were flea beetles, but most of the sites really didn't have a lot of flea beetles, right? Maybe this one site down in Connecticut had not a huge number of flea beetles, but a lot of other things as well. And so that's why you see that sort of reddish color. Potato leafhoppers, again, kind of spotty throughout the region and has a lot to do with the timing. Again, we were doing our sampling, August and then into September, not typically really concerning time period for potato leafhoppers. Again, if you've got a big circle that's yellow out here, that means there weren't a lot of insects, but of those that were out there, a lot of them were potato leafhoppers in this far main site. And then European corn borer, the last one that showed up at all the sites. And again, really not that problematic, and that's consistent with what we were seeing for 2020, right? If we had done this sampling in 2019, the story would have been very different, I'm sure. And so we were expecting to see more corn borer based on what we saw in 2019, but we're pleasantly surprised to not see corn borer for the most part. Right. I just want to zoom in on the data. These are sort of underlying data that we use to develop those heat maps. And I've got, this is a Vermont focused project. So we had more sites in Vermont than all of the other states. But really, again, we're talking about the number of individuals per leaf. And the most telling thing is that aphids were common pretty much throughout all of the sites. And you'll notice the numbers early in the season, so during the flowering time period, these numbers were always lower than the pre-harvest. And so that's showing us very clearly that those aphid numbers, they're pretty much widespread, but also changing, increasing as the season went on, right? All of the others, so flea beetles early, sort of during that flowering time period, the number drops to pre-harvest, and that's consistent with what we'd expect. And then potato leafhoppers, pretty low throughout. We didn't find any European corn borer of note in Vermont, whereas in the other states that we were working on, we do see sort of spotty European corn borer, relatively low incidence, right? But we see the aphid trend is the same thing. Aphids throughout most of the region, but higher in that pre-harvest portion of the season. Right, I'm going to switch gears, talk a little bit about IPM in general in hemp. And really, when it comes down to IPM, this is a sort of cynical view, but IPM was initially developed as an economic modeling strategy, essentially in pest management. It has changed quite a bit over time, but basically, if you boil IPM down, there is injury, right? That's the physical harm that's done to your plant as a result of the pest. But then there's damage, right? How much money you're losing. And so sometimes the injury doesn't necessarily result in damage. And so you really need to think about, right, is this pest actually causing a loss in money, right? And if it is, how much does it would it cost to potentially control it? Right. And so you have to do the math, right? So the example I like to use is Japanese beetles, right? So Japanese beetles, they are certainly doing injury to your plant. You can see this picture here very clearly, those skeletonized leaves, right? But as I've mentioned a couple of times now, Japanese beetles, they're really only present during that sort of July time period. Your plants are growing, especially if you're growing plants for flower. There aren't flowers on the plants yet. They haven't even developed. At the end of that Japanese beetle season, your flowers are maybe just starting to develop, right? So even though you're seeing all of this all of the injury to your plant, there's no actual monetary loss as a result of injury. And actually, Katie Britt, a good friend of mine who just finished up at Virginia Tech and is now headed out to California to continue doing research on Japanese beetles, on hemp, showed very clearly that you can do up to 60% defoliation on hemp and not get any impact in the quality or yield of the flower. So again, all of that injury is not leading to any damage at all. So when it comes down to the economics, it does not make any sense to do anything to control Japanese beetle in hemp. All right, so let's back up and just talk a little bit about sort of the underlying model. Again, I mentioned that IPM was developed as essentially an economic modeling strategy for sort of large agronomic crops, right? So you've got this, let me see if I can get my pointer. You got this hypothetical pest population, right? And so on the y-axis of this graph is the population density of that pest. And on the x-axis is time, right, over the season. And so pest populations naturally go up and down as the season goes on, depending upon the conditions, depending upon the number of generations, that sort of thing, right? And you've got to consider sort of two important values, right? The first is the economic injury level, right? So that's when the cost to control something, right, equals the amount that you're losing, right? So that red line right here, right, is the economic injury level. And the next important population number or density is the threshold, right? And that right here is where we manage our pest populations, because, right, oftentimes if you do something to manage a pest, there's a time lag, right? And so you don't want to wait until you know that you're losing money to start doing something. You want to take those actions ahead of time. And so that's why thresholds were developed. It was to say, all right, if you take action after this population density level, you are likely to lose money going forward, right? So that's sort of the underlying sort of economic modeling that went into IPM. But really, what I like to focus on, and what I think the important thing about IPM, is all of those different things that you can do, right? The proactive strategies that focus on not eradicating, because you're never going to get rid of those pests entirely, but managing the populations such that those numbers never actually make it to the threshold. Right. So there's obviously a strong emphasis on monitoring. You have to know what's going on in the field. You have to know the good guys and the bad guys, right? Because that information ultimately is going to determine what you will and won't do to try to manage those pest populations. The next most important element are cultural controls, the things that you're doing, the varieties that you're choosing that may or may not be susceptible to pests. Like when you're planting, you know, there are mechanical or physical barriers that you can put up. When you're cultivating for weed management, that's a cultural control, right? So all those things that you're doing to manage the pests. There are also all the things that all of those good guys are doing out there for you to manage the pests. There are naturally occurring good guys, what we call native natural enemies, but then there are also there are natural enemies that you can purchase and release, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And the focus of IPM really, again, as I mentioned before, is proactive, not reactive, right? You cannot wait until, oh no, I see that my pest pop, you know, the aphids are at 200 aphids per leaf. Now what do I do, right? And the biggest reason why in general, but specifically for hemp, is because we don't really have the options for a chemical control in hemp. The numbers changing almost daily, but there are very few chemical controls that have been approved, EPA approved, for use in hemp. And so IPM is even more important for hemp than pretty much any other crop, because of the fact that there is no or very few options when it comes to chemical control as a last resort. All right, so I mentioned monitoring is really the most important thing, because you have to know what's out there. You have to have information with which to make decisions, right? So getting out there at least weekly, if not more than weekly, and doing a really good thorough scout, the good guys and the bad guys, because that's the information you're going to use to make the decisions, right? Knowing who's out there to help you. Right. So in Connecticut, there are a bunch of resources available to you. You know, I would immediately point to Suresh, right? But there are other folks at UConn to help with diagnosing the problem if you don't know. And so if I think I have this information right, and if I don't, you can just blame Suresh, because I think he gave it to me. So once you know what's going on, you have to know what you need to be doing. And some of this is a multi-year approach. Some of these things you have to do ahead of time, or you're thinking about the next year. So things like rotations, or removing crop residue, making sure that you're tilling residue in, because what you're doing, particularly if there are pests that are feeding, like flea beetles that feed on roots, right, as larvae. If you're tilling and exposing those pests to natural enemies in the elements, right, you're reducing your flea beetle pressure for the next year. Particularly when it comes to weed management, cultivation and cover cropping can be really important. Depending upon your insect pest, adjacent trap crops, right? Knowing the biology of your pests is really important. Knowing if there are alternative hosts can be useful for predicting what problems are going to arise, in the subsequent years. And then a lot of those pests that we talked about either sort of build over the season, or maybe they arrive on a wind current like a potato leafhopper. And so knowing when the ideal time to transplant, so that you get your plants out there early, get them well established. And so that once you have flea beetles, it doesn't really matter that you're getting those shot hole damage, because the plants are already big enough and are able to withstand a little bit of flea beetle damage or potato leafhopper damage. So biological control, like I mentioned before, something that I've focused a lot of work on in the past. So these are all biocontrol agents that you can purchase for the most part, right? So things like trichogramma. So European corn borer, if it's going to be a problem, right, you can purchase these little wasps, trichogramma wasps, and they will go out and find a European corn borer egg, and they'll lay a parasitoid egg inside that corn borer egg, and then that egg is no longer viable, right? So we like those. Phytoliths is a type of fly that focuses on aphids, right? So you can buy these flies and release them. A lot of these do really well in sort of greenhouse settings, at least the Phytoliths or the predatory mite, not as well in field settings. Whereas the trichogramma obviously are going to do really well in a field setting, because these wasps can fly and find those European corn borer eggs. If you are growing indoors and you have problems with spider mites, Stratiolaelips is really good, because you can get long-term control. So they will get into the cracks and crevices in your greenhouse, and they'll overwinter, and then they can come out, and they can also help with other types of problems like root aphids and some phylums and other things that get into your greenhouse. And then spider mite destroyer, as I mentioned before, these guys are awesome spider mite predators, but they're also naturally occurring. So you can buy them and release them, or you can just let them naturally show up. So where do you get them? Well, there's this sort of what I call the big organic, right? So Arabico Organics, they're out in California. You can order a lot of these things in. I'd like to promote sort of local suppliers. Carol Glenister at IPM Labs in New York. They're sort of the closest to a local source. And in the end, a lot of these biocontrol agents are coming from the same suppliers to begin with. They just, the middleman or middle woman in the case of IPM Labs is just close by. But what I love to talk about is not those things that you can buy and have them, sort of added to your agricultural systems, but those that you can naturally promote. So things like ladybugs, hoverflies, lacewing spiders, right? All of those are naturally occurring predators. And you can do things like planting insectary buffers. So buffers of things like buckwheat that have those flowers provide resources for the hoverfly adults, and you can get lots of adults in your agricultural ecosystems. Thinking about the way that you manage your weeds, and the way that you, if you do spray anything, like I said, there are fewer chemical options for hemp, but certainly when you start thinking about whatever chemicals you're applying, are going to impact your beneficials as well. So you got to think about both the good guys and the bad guys when you start making those decisions. I do want to talk very briefly about weed management, just because it's important in hemp. Mainly from my perspective, it's important because of a sort of the whole farm management piece, right? So if you're managing your weeds well, you're also potentially managing your diseases and your insects as well. So this picture actually is from, I don't know if it's a seed, grain, or fiber trial. But if you are growing direct seed, and actually now with like day neutral varieties, you can get some hemp seed that you might direct seed, and so those are when they're these tiny little baby seedlings. If you've direct seeded, that weeds can really smother your planting. But for the most part, at least in New England, folks that are growing for flower, you're transplanting, right? So you're not really worried about that stale seed bed for weed management, because you're putting transplants in the ground. You're either putting transplants without a plastic mulch or with a plastic mulch. So that's pretty much what most folks in our area are doing. It's actually a picture from the south, and so you'll notice that it's white plastic, not black plastic, because they've got problems with heat. So again, as those plants mature, right? And again, this is a picture from down south where they've got white plastic. Up north, we use black plastic mulch, but it's essentially the same. You've got a couple of options, right? You can use that plastic mulch, which is really helpful, particularly when you're talking about weeds like grasses that might have septoria, where you can get splash up. So if you've got a lot of splash up from the soil, right, that can cause particularly disease problems lower and down. And so having that black plastic, or white in the case of this picture, is helpful for weed management, but also for disease management. But increasingly, people are asking, why do I need to have plastic at all? And you can very successfully grow without plastic mulch at all, right? You do have to do some cultivation between your rows, and then early in the season within row. But once your plants are established, you really don't need the black plastic, right? You've got a couple of options. So actually, these are some pictures. So this is one with plastic and then a cover crop in between. And then this is, I guess it's an intercrop technically. And then this is no black plastic with a cover crop planted as an intercrop. So again, you've got your hemp, your intercrop of like an annual ryegrass or something, and then you got hemp and then annual ryegrass. And so by sowing that annual ryegrass, your ryegrass is outcompeting any potential weeds. I just want to mention a couple of things. If you look really carefully, these are two pictures from two sets of pictures. This is from one site that I was at last year. This is from another site. And I like to use these as sort of examples. So this is actually a farm in New York. And they have the genetics they're really happy with. It's Bayox from down south. And these guys are grown, I think, at a 3-inch spacing, both within the row and between row. And you'll notice that you essentially have a continuous canopy and of hemp. There's a little bit of weed. So this was late in the season. You can see the flowers are already starting to develop, and there's almost no weeds down here, right? So what they've essentially done is a nice solid canopy, right, with no weeds underneath. I kind of like that.
Scott, right? You mean 3 feet spacing?
Sorry, did I say 3 inches?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes. I'm thinking onion land right now. Yeah. So 3 foot spacing. Sorry for the confusion. So this farm here in Vermont, they went with something more similar to, I think most folks are doing like a 5 foot, not 5 inch, 5 foot spacing. And they also have these really small plant. I don't remember the variety, but this is a really, really tightly packed plant. But you'll notice there's a huge space between the plants. And in there are a ton of, this is mostly grass weeds. And actually, when I was out at this farm, they were in the process of spraying essentially millstop pretty much I can't remember what it was, every 3 days because they were having serious leaf spot issues. So this is inside the canopy, right? And so the conditions that are promoting the septoria growth on the weeds were also leading to septoria or leaf spots on the plants, right? And so thinking about the intersection of genetics and agronomics so that you have your plants spaced correctly will really help for things like weed management, disease management, that sort of thing. All right, where am I here? I do want to just give a plug out for the fact that you really need to, when it comes down to making decisions about chemical controls, know what is and what isn't allowed. And so in Connecticut, you guys use the same Kelly solutions that we use in Vermont. You go and you figure out what specific chemicals are allowable, because if you get to the point where you do need to take action, you've got to prevent the loss of money, right? And there are some options, not when it comes to weed management. As far as I know, there are no herbicides approved for use in hemp, but there are some insecticides and fungicides that are approved for use in hemp. They're basically almost entirely, not entirely, but mostly organic, right? So you go and you figure out what's allowable, but make sure that you're using only approved chemicals. And I'll end really quickly by saying, really, you need to make sure that you get your information from those state websites or state approved websites, and not from the manufacturers of the chemicals themselves. So Marone Bioinnovations, great company. They provide a lot of organic options for other crops, but you go to their website, you can find, if you go to their website, you can find this cannabis pest guide, and they tell you all of the different pests that you have to worry about and their products that you can apply, and even the rates and everything like that. But that alone is not useful, because they do have an EPA registration, right? They are registered for use in Connecticut, but they're not, at least as of yesterday when I looked at Kelly registration, these products are not registered for use on hemp in Connecticut. Same thing in Vermont. Also, you'll notice this product, Jet Ag, is EPA registered, but it's not registered for anything in Connecticut, right? So again, make sure that you're going to those state-approved websites or state-sponsored websites to be getting your information about what can and can't be used. All right, so again, I talked about a bunch of the things that are out there, both good and bad. I talked about when you might see them, right? And again, the sort of take home from our scouting was that some of those, particularly things like aphids, they build up over the season. So keeping an eye on how things are progressing is very, very helpful. And it's helpful because you have to use systems, particularly when it comes to hemp, because of the lack of chemical options. You really have to use a systems approach, thinking about all of the tools that are available, right? How to access them, and being proactive so that you aren't surprised when you do or don't have an option in the case of hemp. All right, so I think, Suresh, I think you said 45 minutes or so,
Yep.
and then time for questions. And so I went a little over, I apologize, but this is my email address. Feel free to email me. And then this is a link to the Northwest Crops and Soils website that has a lot of information about research trials, some of which I know Heather shared with you all a few weeks ago. And just want to acknowledge we got some funding from SARE as well as Northeast IPM Center to do research that I've shared with you. So with that, if there are questions, if you want to yell at me for mixing up inches and feet, I apologize. I'm happy to chat with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. a lot of very good information. I have a lot of questions on my mind. I can start from there, and I encourage folks to type in their question or ask us to unmute so we can get you unmuted. I guess Jip can help with that. Again, just emphasizing that the Connecticut DEEP, Department of Environmental Protection, has a guideline document for with a list of pesticides that can be used in hemp, and I provided a link to
Awesome.
that in
Thank
the
you,
chat
Suresh.
box.
Actually, I had something similar for Vermont, and I took it out and didn't have time to find the one for Connecticut. So thank you for doing that for me.
No problem. And thank you so much, Scott, for all the great information and sharing your great work. I'm interested. I also saw some damage and found European corn borer in hemp fields last year and previous year. Do we know which strain? Is it Iowa or New York that is more attracted, or both?
I don't know the answer. I assume New York, just because we see more of them in our area, but I don't know if one prefers hemp more than the other. It's a great idea.
Yeah.
We should write a grant proposal.
I put trap for New York and didn't catch any in that field, but again, in that field there was no damage or no any other sign.
I'm wondering, was there a lot of corn being grown in the area too?
Yeah, it's probably, as you mentioned, corn is preferred crop.
Yeah.
They went toward that direction. Yeah. And Scott, we talked about threshold, and we don't have thresholds for, especially for hemp, so much. So when we don't have a guideline in terms of how many aphids your crop can tolerate, and when you should start making doing action, how would you what would be your opinion on starting to intervene for some of the major insects that we see in our region, aphids, European corn borer, flea beetle? What would be your suggestion?
So yeah, I mean, a lot of crops we don't have thresholds, and so some of it is just getting an idea for your level of comfort, right? So and that comes with experience. So if you grow hemp for a couple of years and you notice that you were getting increasing number of aphids, and that was, you were starting to see problems, then you're gonna have to use your own experience when it comes to aphids. But things like European corn borer, those you can use sort of the trap counts from corn to inform the timing of releasing of a trichogramma wasps, for instance. So to a certain extent, the fact that there's no threshold, it isn't really going to be a problem for hemp, because there are essentially no insecticides that you really can use as those like salvage insect, right? Like if you, in other crops where you have a threshold, usually at that threshold, you're then spraying something. We don't have those options in hemp. And so it's forcing us to be proactive anyway. And so, yeah, so I don't know if that was helpful
Sure.
for things like aphids, but certainly for things like European corn borer, you can use the trap counts for timing of a thing like something like a release of a wasp in your hemp.
Yeah, thanks. And somebody in the chat box mentioned they saw Eurasia hemp borer in Connecticut last season and backed up by another member. So that was that I didn't see Eurasian corn borer in my scouting, but yeah, I think it's most widely found in Midwest, in Kentucky and in that region.
So the trichogramma, I don't know the timing of Eurasian corn borer, but the trichogramma wasps, typically they're generalists. They will lay their egg in any type of caterpillar egg. And so if you've got the timing right and you've got wasps out for European corn borer, Eurasian hemp borer, you're going to get some control as well.
Yeah, okay, good to know that. Yeah. And I get quite a few questions about doing no-till versus till from beginner hemp growers.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the insect management, is one better versus other?
For insects, I don't think it's gonna matter. And I've seen some folks do sort of like a low till where they'll only basically till just like that one little spot where the hemp transplant's going in and then leave everything else untilled. As well as I've seen sort of strips where only the beds will get tilled up and then leaving those the spaces in between. From an insect pest management standpoint, I don't see a difference for either. I think it's bigger for diseases and weeds.
Okay. Yeah. And Virginia mentions that Arbico lists a few beneficials for Eurasian hemp borer.
Perfect.
Thank you, Virginia, for saying that.
I think I called it Eurasian corn borer before. Sorry.
Yeah. So,
actually, so you said
yeah.
it was if Virginia can. I'm curious. I can't see the chat, unfortunately, but if she could post what some of those beneficials are, I'm just curious.
Can we get her Virginia muted, Jeff? Unmuted, so she could share. Virginia, I think you can.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Okay, awesome. So I'm a USDA organic certified produce grower in the Northeast corner. I did hemp for the for my first season last year. For fun, for research, I'm actually teaching cannabis courses at Quinebaug Valley Community College. I'm doing the horticulture of cannabis class as well as cannabis law and policy. So we found the Eurasian corn borer right at harvest. We were, taking off flower, and we were like, what's this brown stuff on the stem? But we went, so teaching the horticulture class, we went out looking for beneficials, and Arbico did list a few that would go for the eggs, so that, the eggs would be destroyed before they hatch and then bore into the stem or into the leaves and then into the stem. So Arbico does have a few beneficials, so we're going to try those. I'm going to just release them just to be proactive. And of course, making sure that we have no plant material left because they overwinter, in the stems of plant material. So we made sure we burnt everything from last season. But we're still going to be a little proactive. I don't know where it came from. I know that knotweed is, I think, a host. So we're going to be making sure we don't have any knotweed around the property too. So, but I guess other growers have been seeing it in Connecticut. I would say that maybe it hit, I would say maybe 5 to maybe 8% of our plants.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I did not see any Eurasian hemp borer in my scouting.
I think what Virginia was saying really highlights the importance of those cultural controls that I was talking about before. The sanitation, making sure that any plant material is either removed or tilled under so it can break down. Right, those are all things that you can do now to sort of invest in pest management next season.
Thanks for sharing, Virginia. Prov is asking, what do you guys think of thermal weed control for use in hemp flowering?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A little bit more. So is that like tarping to like a solarization?
Yeah. Can you expand on that, probe, or can we get probe unmuted first, Jeff? Okay, you can go ahead and unmute yourself now.
Hello?
Hello.
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, basically using like one of those flame jets from a propane torch.
Yep.
To get rid of the weeds. What do you guys think of that?
So certainly, like flame weeding is used in other crops. I know it's very successfully used, like in organic vegetable production. I don't know of anyone that's using flame weeding in hemp. Certainly, there. Yeah, my experience is it's labor intensive. And so on a large scale, it can sometimes it's labor intensive and cost quite a bit. I don't know, Suresh, do you have experience with flame weeding?
Not much. I know it's successful in corn, and as hemp is such a resilient crop, I think it's probably worth trying it if it's not cost prohibited in your case, because even if there is a little bit of damage from the flame, hemp is such a resilient plant and it can come up, it can resume.
Yeah, I would assume, again, I don't have experience with this, but I would assume that if you're doing if you're really serious about no-till, coming through just prior to transplanting with a flame weeder, you might have some success. And then I see.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate that.
Yeah, so it looks like Virginia shared Flame Engineering makes a walk-along 4-burner unit, as well as 3-point hitch units, and they are costly.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks Virginia for sharing, and thanks Rob for participating. Looks like those were the questions we had in the chat box. Please feel free to type them in if there are more. Otherwise, I will go ahead and wrap up this webinar today.
So really quickly, I just want to, so I was doing a little multitasking and looked up Eurasian hemp borer, and Arabico does have a trichogramma wasp. It's a different species, but it is a wasp that they recommend. And again, it's Arabico's website, so they're selling stuff, obviously, so take that with a grain of salt. But so trichogramma, at least according to Arabico, also would be effective for Eurasian hemp borer.
Yeah. And Jeff, I think, is asking, what's this? Are you talking about here Eurasian hemp borers, Jeff? Oh, can you see this, Scott?
I can, and I wish I could tell you, but certainly email it, and what we can do is circulate it amongst all of the folks that we work with in New York and New England who are working on hemp, and we can try to figure out what it is.
Yeah, that would be a good idea. Awesome. Okay, so all the registrant to today's webinar will receive a brief survey about today's hemp webinar. Please take the time to fill in your thoughts and comments, as your feedback is very important to us. And thank you all for attending today's webinar. Very special thanks to Scott Lewins for your time and expertise. And thank you again to our planning partners and the planning committee that includes Amanda Fargo Johnson, Matt DeBacco, Becky Gotts, John Ireland, Kate Nelson, Jim Hyde, and myself, Suresh Kamire. And special thanks to Jeff Wenzel for hosting the webinar series. And this webinar has been recorded and will be available for viewing shortly at Connecticut RC&D website, www.rcnd.org/hemp and on YouTube. We invite you all to check out the website. And thank you again for joining us this afternoon. I hope you have a great day. And Scott just put his email address in the chat box. I will put mine before we wrap up. So if you have any question, please reach out to us. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so
And
much.
thanks, Scott. Have a great day.
Likewise.